funny, I'm looking at the radar here this morning and there's something to watch. So here we are on Thursday, have some light rain moving through the kind of Tennessee Valley here into the Carolinas. Actually had a dusting of snow overnight across portions of Illinois, maybe Indiana here over Bloomington. If you look closely, that radar showing that kind of bright banding signature, that's indicative that it's trying to change back over to sleet and then rainfall kind of near the Ohio River Valley, but decent little low tracking through here this morning. Even had some lightning recorded near some of those stronger returns there, so some thunder kind of northeast of Nashville with this, but otherwise pretty quiet morning here across the continental U.S. Can see that in the all hazards map. Some two-leaf fog in California, a few red flag warnings lingering along the front range, the hill country of Texas. You can see a high wind watch here with some higher winds expected across the Golden Triangle, portions of Montana, one red flag warning kind of lingering there in Florida, and some winter weather advisories here for portions of off the lakeshore and Lake Ontario there. Again, otherwise pretty quiet. Some flood advisories there near getting over toward Knoxville in Tennessee. Last 24 hours of precipitation kind of showed that light snow tracking through the Midwest, more so in the evening and overnight. Some of that heavier rain there, that thunder that we just recorded there, again, kind of near to the northeast of Nashville. Otherwise, fairly quiet across the continental U.S. Now, things are changing elsewhere. Eric touched on the momentum picture yesterday. I was going to start my day looking up at the jet stream here, often here on earth.nullschool.net. I invite you to check that out. It's just earth.nullschool.net. Can get a good picture of what's going on where with respect to those jet stream level winds around the globe. And I noticed a few kind of interesting things looking at this morning, more so elsewhere beyond the continental U.S. One, I'm starting here in kind of Central America, more so down even near South America. And I noticed this kind of reflection or this mirror in the subtropical jet stream kind of straddling Western South America, kind of the far Eastern Pacific here. And you can see this activity in the subtropical jet stream, both on the north and the south side of the equator here, northern and southern hemisphere. And you actually see reverse flow up at 250 millibars here, right along the equator. And that's kind of an interesting feature, because when we kind of correlate El Nino 1 and 2, which is this area of the Eastern Pacific now, El Nino sort of proper, if you will, we would think of more so as warm water over here in the Central Pacific, but we do track another area here called El Nino 1 and 2. And when this El Nino 1 and 2 kind of gets going, we often see it move out into a proper El Nino. It often kind of gets its start over here right near the Galapagos Islands. And this kind of dual mirrored subtropical jet activity is fairly indicative of those El Nino 1 plus 2 episodes. And sure enough, if we go over and just correlate El Nino 1 and 2 with zonal wind in the jet stream, which we were just looking at, that would be wind in that direction over those two areas that we just looked at, and a lack of wind here, lack of zonal wind, which would mean reversal, like easterly winds. And that's exactly what we see here. So again, another sign here in our atmosphere. Right now, we looked at so many of these forecasts that heading into El Nino, but there's a sign right now that this atmosphere is starting to adjust, starting to look more El Nino here. At the end of February, that one's just El Nino 1 and 2, but often that precursor over to El Nino proper later this year in 2026. Another kind of interesting quirk is you saw those higher correlation values like over here, just in the North Atlantic on the northern hemisphere side of the equator here. We jump back and look at that jet stream over there near Africa. It's cranking too, just north of the equator. In fact, we looked at that momentum picking up yesterday in the forecast that Eric talked through. I'm going to track this jet stream flow here almost near the equator. Again, just tracking this here this morning across the continent of Africa, through the Middle East, across the Himalayas. Look at how zonal and extended this is all the way through like Okinawa, Japan, back down through the Pacific. We don't really see a break in that jet stream flow until you get all the way over here in the North Pacific when it kind of splits and amplifies. Not an uncommon presentation in La Nina, but it's just kind of funny. That's a lot of momentum that we have to work through over the next few weeks. That's cranking jet. It's kind of almost one coherent piece all the way to the North Pacific before it splits into this other piece over North America, kind of putting it all together here this morning as El Nino seems to kind of be rearing its head in spring of 2026. Eric mentioned this yesterday. There's that increasing momentum. Expecting that weather probably going to get more interesting over the next 4 weeks. We'll take that. It's always interesting in spring to help remove some of this drought here. That is kind of the hope at this point. If we look at the Climate Prediction Center probabilities, just looking out further into March, looking at those probabilities of higher rainfall here, March 5th through March 7th, in this broader region of a higher activity week between March 5th and March 11th, and right through that corridor, Dallas-Fort Worth, through Little Rock into southern Missouri, southern central Illinois, kind of extending over toward Indiana. That's that corridor we're watching very closely. To this point, a little bit concerned about flooding. Now, I'll talk about the specifics of this in a second, but the CPC upgrading to this moderate risk concern for heavy precip, March 5th through the 11th. Now, to get us there, we still have this kind of northwest flow, almost La Nina-like setup in the atmosphere, warmer to the southwest, and cooler Clipper systems to the east. In fact, we started our day with one of these Clipper systems here, but I'm going to take this forecast forward. You can see that initial system here through the day today and into tonight, exiting east. Don't see much going on through the weekend. Maybe kind of a weak little system tracking through here on Saturday. We'll talk about that in a second. It's almost hard to make out. And then Sunday into Monday, it's really hard to tell, but there is a little shortwave coming through, and it's going to be it's almost like a ghost in the lower heights here. You're going to see it track. I'm going to play this back. You see this little area of lower heights tracking through the Midwest there. That's going to be our Sunday to Monday weather maker through this corridor here. We're going to get return flow. We finally moved this ridge that was situated over here at the beginning of the forecast by early next week. It's right over the central U.S. That's going to allow return flow back into this area. And that's going to begin what's going to be a very active pattern March 3rd, probably through the 11th. Now, here comes a proper weather maker coming around the Continental Divide. That's on Wednesday, probably kicking off a more coherent low pressure system right into that moisture return flow. So almost like a collision with a lot of Gulf moisture right in the middle part of the country, and another system coming up behind that March 5th through the 6th. And now we transition, a week and a half later from where we started this forecast with, here's a big trough over the southwest, no longer a ridge. Our ridge is now over here. We could call it like a Rochester and New York ridge, and just cranking southwest flow with embedded shortwave troughs moving through the middle of the country. It's almost hard to draw sort of a better pattern for precip and potentially severe weather in this quarter here. Certainly heavy rainfall, but even some chances for like southern plains or mid-south severe with some of this, maybe even some of that getting up into like the Midwest proper, maybe Missouri or southern Illinois. So plenty to talk about. These videos are going to get longer, I think, as we go through March here, but at least for today, this one probably going to err on the shorter side. Jumping over, we'll look at the precip situation here from the East MWF. There's that kind of, we'll call it a clipper, coming through the mid-south here. That sort of extends out onto a front across the Gulf Coast states there over to the Carolinas through this evening. Some light snow showers moving through Canada. Another weak clipper. I talked about that little filament moving through on Saturday. You can see that they're just as dusting of snow screaming across the Midwest overnight. Sunday morning, we start to see that next one. Remember, this was that like little ghostly shortwave coming across that northwest flow. You can actually see this picking up in a decent snowfall rates, like I-74 corridor, even like down to near I-70, Bloomington, Indianapolis. We're toward like Bloomington, Illinois, Champaign, Danville. Maybe getting a nice little shot of snow here, just a few inches, but that's a nice little shot of snow Sunday night into Monday. On the back side of that, by Tuesday, remember we talked about that return flow, plenty of moisture. We can follow these isobars all the way up into the middle part of the country. And you can almost just follow them into that collision course that we talked about throughout the week next week. So rainfall spreading across the Midwest, western kind of corn belt here on Tuesday. That continues on Wednesday, stretching anywhere from New Jersey, Long Island, all the way back toward the Panhandle, Oklahoma. These same areas, almost the same exact geography and county where we had those wildfires showing up with a higher precipitation value. Now on Wednesday, March 4th, I'm going to play this forecast forward, and it's going to be more of the same. You're going to see this low continue to consolidate across the Midwest, extend up into Wisconsin, rainfall stretching back through the Dallas-Fort Worth area on Thursday. And then remember, as we got further out, that trough established itself across the western U.S., and now we have more southwest flow across the central U.S. as we get into the weekend. So it's just precip, low, not a lot of backside snow. The earlier initial presentation, like Tuesday through Thursday, was more zonal with rainfall extending out like this. As you get further out into the forecast through next weekend, it starts to extend on an axis like this where we're seeing that heaviest precipitation. We'll get snowfall forecast through the period. Again, despite it getting more active with all that return flow and warmth across the central and eastern U.S., not nearly as much snowfall coming out of this event here. We were a little bit worried that this corridor here could go gangbusters again, but not nearly seeing as much of that as some of the early systems here this weekend have weakened rather than amplified. Little shot that we talked about Sunday into Monday across the Midwest. You can see that there, anywhere from like 2 to 4 inches is possible across that I-74 corridor. A little bit higher values up here as some of these lows kind of sneak up, but again, not seeing any too significant of precipitation. With the snow deficits here, would have liked to see more snow get in here with the snow deficits out west. Would have liked to see more snow get in here out of the 10-day forecast. But we'll take some. This is some. We can't discount this in the Cascades, getting up near a foot of snowfall there. Foot of snowfall like the Wasatch Range. Those are the Uintas, the only west to east mountain chain in the Colorado Rockies, or maybe the western U.S. Don't quote me on that, but I remember learning that at some point. All right, not as much snowfall out of this. I'm going to jump over, show you some of these precipitation values. They're just kind of fun to look at this point. The ECMWF Ensemble 14-day precipitometers takes us all the way out through March 11th. Drier for California and the West, but anywhere between central Texas all the way over toward Indiana, western PA, Ohio, Wisconsin, above average precipitation on the way. Certainly for Missouri, Oklahoma, particularly eastern Oklahoma, northwest Arkansas, southern Illinois, southwest Indiana, the areas in that moderate risk now for heavy rain and potentially flooding out of the system. We just look at the ECMWF proper. Next 5 days, some systems coming through this weekend. Out through March 5th, kind of the middle part of next weekend, they start to consolidate. We start to extend that out into the next, fully through the next weekend. That's when the heaviest precipitation kind of coming through that axis south to north, as we mentioned. Putting it together, there's that area of heavier precipitation. There are some chances kind of later in the forecast for the southeast to go over wet, but some of these areas kind of bracketing the southern plain precipits staying drier. In fact, the Climate Prediction Center kind of highlighting this quarter and spring for their greatest chance of reduced precipitation. So kind of keeping an eye on these two regions, kind of bracketing that axis for kind of precursor drought risk to begin with. If we look over at the ECMWF ensemble probabilities, I made this the total probability out through March 13th. So it took this all the way out to the 15-day forecast. Probabilities of precipitation exceeding a total of 4 inches here. You can see, again, eastern Oklahoma, northeast Texas, much of the state of Missouri, much of southern Illinois and southern Indiana, looking at a 50 or 60% chance plus of that 4-inch or more precipitation value by the beginning of March. So essentially getting your March's worth of precipitation, if not more, in just about a week time here. Impressive rainfall event. There are some of these areas here we're going to have to watch out. Potentially flooding. You're talking maybe 7, 8 inches of rainfall in some localized areas, maybe even more than that. Let's hope not. But there is that risk of flooding there as we recoup a lot of the soil moisture, which isn't doing fantastic in some of these areas. In fact, if I pick on some of these locations here, like if we do Joplin, kind of right in the middle of this, a lot going on in this chart here. This is our year-to-date precip chart for Joplin. I'm actually looking back to last year in 2025. That's in gray. And we flatlined from November 15th, not a drop or flake of precip all the way through the new year. Then we jumped into this year, which is in blue. Flatline continued a little like hair of precip, like 0.1, maybe 0.25. That continued, had one finally decent rainfall event up near an inch or two in Joplin here about a week ago, in the middle of February, then had flatlined after that. But look in the forecast in yellow, just rain, rising all the way up into our highest value in March versus the last 5 years in Joplin. Similar story if we go over here near Terre Haute in Indiana. Look at all the dry autumns that we've had in Indiana. Every time I head over that way, people complaining about winter drought, overwintering dryness in the soil. That continued in 2025. It's almost hard to see 25 because it's buried in here in all these other fall drought years below that average line at the end of the year. Continued that precip deficit in the new year, just these little blips of rainfall. Supposed to be averaging something like that, but here comes that pattern change. And again, rising up to a highest value here in spring compared to the last 5 years, if that forecast comes to fruition. We have some decent confidence in it at this point as well. Looking further out into the forecast, because this kind of wet period is taking us decently into the forecast period right now, we're not seeing that huge kind of next pattern shift beyond that right now. Just March 8th, March 9th, you're getting a little bit too far out in the forecast as it begins anyway. If we do look at the long-range forecast right now, continues to stay wet. Again, March 6th through the 12th, that's when that axis of heavier precip tilts more southwest to northeast across that corridor. You're seeing that there from the Climate Prediction Center. The good news is the further out we get in the forecast, I mentioned this, the southeast starts to look a little bit wetter. And that's one area where we've had red flag warnings this spring where we're a little bit concerned heading into the new year in 2026 as well. But unfortunately, looking at these precip, I don't see California returning significantly wetter. We do see that improved snowpack across the Intermountain West, Colorado Rockies, the Front Range. See that in the Climate Prediction Center as well. CPC, you can see why they've excluded California from what's essentially higher than average precip probabilities for much of the western continental U.S. here. So the Miracle March doesn't appear to be on tap right now for California. There's probably one last chance as that momentum picks back up at the end of March. You saw that discussion from Eric yesterday. It's possible to get those late atmospheric rivers in, maybe like mid to late March, early April. But that's usually just about the last chance before the Pacific jumps over into its spring-summer trend there. Looking at temperatures, kind of a similar story, that the next kind of forecast change isn't really on the horizon yet. Warmer in the eastern U.S. I mentioned that Rochester, New York ridge as we go further out of the forecast. New England finally getting the warmth. All that snowfall over there in Rhode Island, the 40 inches or so, is probably going to be melting to some degree as we warm up here in the beginning of March. Looking at the AFS, I'm looking down here in the right corner. With all that low track and that storm track coming through, there is that possibility that we kind of swing back on the backside of it, go cold, drag down some of this cold air that's just been locked up here in Canada so often as we've turned to the new calendar year here. And so there is some possibility that the Central Plains gets kind of rocked with one of these Arctic fronts a little bit later in March. I'm talking like March 10th plus. We'll keep an eye on that, but that's just one scenario right now. It's not something I can conclude with much confidence, but just given the storm track in this corridor, that cold front trajectory will be something like that. So we still have a lot of this cold air here, something to keep an eye on as we get out into the middle of March. Looking at the extended forecast, if I force the ECMWF extended model to exclude the next crazy flurry of storm tracks through the middle part of the country, it still wants to put down some wetter values here in the Midwest, the Ohio River Valley, and the Mid-Atlantic. Curiously, kind of going back over drier for the Southern Plains. Now, I don't say that with much conviction because you're talking, little blips here in the forecast. But as far as the signal goes, I see something more like that than the opposite. So I have to see where we go in the Southern Plains. Like Eric mentioned, this has been kind of a pretty standard scenario that's played out where we have Southern Plains drought, dust wildfires, and then we go crazy wet. And again, if we go wet in this corridor, Eric and I bring this up all the time, sometimes we call it like the Nashville Little Rock rule. If we stay wet in this corridor, build that moisture in here, gets into the trees. There's a lot of those in this corridor here, gets into the soil, gets into the some of the delta regions here. It's kind of a savings bank of moisture for areas and geographies further toward the north later in the year. We do not find a lot of significant drought years in this area of the country when this area stays wet. It just works out that way. We'll continue to watch El Nino. We're certainly into an El Nino for that 1+2 region I mentioned earlier. We're starting to see the atmosphere respond to that. So it's always kind of two things we look for. One, those sea surface temperatures can start to change, but is the atmosphere responding along with that as well? We'll continue to watch the Northeast Pacific. We think that's going to be a pretty big pivot point in 2026, just as it was in 25 and 2023. But I'll end it there today. I think that was my last slide. Again, shorter video today, but I suspect between March 5th and March 10th, these are going to get a little bit more exciting, and we'll see what March holds after that. Thanks for watching.